Okay, let's start session. I would like to thanks a lot.
Do you want me to just go ahead?
Yeah, I just will have a short presentation. Juliet Schor is professor of sociology at Boston College. It's also a member of the MacArthur Foundation Connected Learning Research Network. Schor's research focuses on consumption, time using, and environmental sustainability. She's a graduate of Wesleyan University and received her PhD in economics at the University of Massachusetts. Before joining Boston College, she taught at Harvard University for 17 years in the Department of Economics in the Committee on Degrees in Women's Studies. In 2014, Schor received the American Sociological Association Award of Public Understanding of Sociology. I think that today we will have the opportunity to discuss with her several interesting questions about the gig economy and the platform economy. So Juliet, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. As I was saying to folks just when I came on, I'm going to talk about the gig economy. I've been studying that for the last 10 years, sort of labor issues situated in the context of some larger issues in labor economics. We have a fair amount of time, so in the discussion, I'm happy to also talk about some of my other research, in particular work on the drivers of carbon emissions and also shorter work time, which is something that I've been got back to after years earlier working on that. So let me just pull up my PowerPoint and get started. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to talk about the gig economy. If you have followed the news, and this is something that's happening around the world, you will know that gig workers have begun to really organize to get better conditions and stop exploitation and so forth from these platform companies. This is a slide from the United States, May 8th, 2020, which was the first global strike of ride-hail drivers. In September of 2020, California, the largest state in the US, passed a bill called Assembly Bill 5, which converted all these gig workers into employees. The companies refused to go along, and they put a proposition, what's called a proposition, on the ballot for the next election, which was 2 months later. And they were able to, it was a year later, but sorry, it was in 2020. They were able to, quote unquote, buy themselves a new law, the companies. They spent over $200 million, the most expensive ballot proposition in American history, versus like about 10 million that the unions and workers were able to come up with. And since winning that, which was their workers were carved out from the law. So they were no longer eligible to be considered employees with all the benefits and minimum wage and sick time, unemployment insurance, and so forth that goes along with employment status. So they were back to being independent contractors with no rights whatsoever. And after winning that law, the companies opened similar fights in a number of other states, including my own Massachusetts, and those fights are ongoing. it's not just drivers and food delivery workers, but also shoppers. This is one of quite a few walkouts organized for people who are gig workers in grocery stores, bringing groceries to people. And that's a type of work that expanded tremendously, obviously, during the pandemic. So in order to understand these, why are these workers striking? Why is there so much contention about this? How do we understand gig work? Much of the debate has been sort of, this is a great innovation. This is terrible. It's exploitative. I want to move beyond that debate, and we can come back to that, of course, but to try and understand analytically what's going on with gig work. What's different about these platforms, if anything? What difference does the technology make? Of course, they're using different technologies than what I'll be calling conventional employers. Although I should say that more and more quote unquote conventional firms are starting to use some of these algorithmic technologies that the platforms are using. So it's getting a little bit of blurry on the edges. Do they have unique features? Is employee status feasible? And that's something I've just done a new study on. And how malleable are these platforms? So I've been studying, as I may have mentioned, for 10 years, gig labor. And in some ways, the bottom line that I want to give you here is that I think we need to understand these, at least at the moment, as a new kind of regime for labor. Okay, one small word here about terminology. Many different terms used to talk about the sector that I'm going to be describing. Now, I'm going to mostly use the word gig labor, platform economy. Actually, what I'm talking about is narrower than the platform economy. The platform economy includes Google and Facebook and so forth. So I'm not talking about social media. I'm talking about on-demand services. So this gig labor that I've been studying is on-demand services, typically to consumers. I have one case that's a business site, but it went originally by terms like collaborative economy, collaborative consumption, then the sharing economy. Of course, people began to say, hey, there's nothing sharing going on if you're talking about an Uber driver. Digital economy, of course, is much broader, on-demand services, etc. Peer economy, access. Anyway, lots of different terminology. And again, I'm happy to talk more about that. What is really key here is that a major innovation of these platforms, if we're thinking about ride hail or food delivery, or particularly in the earlier days, and I'll tell you why in a minute, Airbnb, is that the original model was taking strangers, or what we call peers, individuals, and putting them together, and sort of the platforms were facilitating what I called stranger exchange. And what this did was it opened up a range of markets, many of which existed only in very small form, and which tended to be more among known others. So within social networks, this peer-to-peer exchange and transactions tended to be going on. The first big markets here were in secondhand goods, so Craigslist and eBay. But what you got with the rise of this, what was originally called the sharing economy, was these in-person services. So rather than goods, so a ride or a room to stay in, or a food delivery, and so forth. And the technologies of crowdsourced ratings and reputation were part of what made this possible. It made people feel that the risks of transacting with an unknown other were small enough that they were going to be willing to do it. And some of these exchanges are quite intimate: getting into the car of someone you don't know, going to stay at the home of someone you don't know, or letting a stranger come into your car or your home, or buy your groceries or do your errands for you, or fix your television, or so forth. Now, what's different is that traditionally, companies would develop brands and reputations that would manage this risk. So I would go to a hotel because I trusted that brand. And so the companies in these consumer services, the companies stood between the consumers and these, so they did the providing, and they would vouch for and take the reputational risk and so forth. What you get with the sharing economy or these in-person services is this automated kind of crowdsourced informational process that's purpose is to reduce that risk through ratings and reviews. A little asterisk here is to say that these ratings and review systems aren't all that good. The quality of the ratings and reviews are problematic, and I'm not sure how much risk they actually avoid. But what is more important is that consumers felt comfortable enough using these systems that these markets really expanded very rapidly. And again, I can go a lot more into that dimension of things. I was planning to focus, or the presentation focuses more on the labor issues. So just a little bit of background on what the research I'm going to be describing today on the project. So my first project was founded by the MacArthur Foundation. It ran from 2011 to 2018. These are the 7 main graduate students, all PhD students in sociology, who I worked on this project with, and we produced a book called After the Gig, which I reference in the title. And then since 2019, I'm working with a team at Northeastern University on a National Science Foundation project on the future of work, which is called the Algorithmic Workplace. And we're working a little bit more on the algorithms. Let me just show you here these are the companies, the cases, or the platforms that we are studying. The ones on the left are the ones that I studied in the first round. So Airbnb, Taskrabbit, which is an errand site, Turo, which is kind of Airbnb for cars, peer-to-peer car rental, Postmates and Favor, which were food delivery, Uber and Lyft, ride hail, and then Stocksy, which is a platform that is owned by the workers themselves. So it's what we call a platform cooperative, and I can talk more about that. We did the first academic study of a platform cooperative. Then starting here with Uber Eats, all of these are from the Northeastern project. So Amazon shoppers, Instacart shoppers, Deliv, which is a national, it's now been acquired, but was a national package delivery. That was a business to consumer. DoorDash, which is food delivery, Uber Eats, food delivery, Amazon Flex, which is drivers. So a lot of driving and delivery, as well as errands and accommodations. So a wide range. And we've done a lot of different studies. We've looked at racial discrimination. We've looked at the culture of these things. We've looked at vulnerabilities. We've looked at the ratings and reputation systems, as well as many different aspects of the labor systems. And I also have another project that's looking at the environmental impact, so carbon emissions of Airbnb. So I do just want to mention also, I haven't included this in the talk, but again, for the Q&A, we started out actually looking at sort of nonprofit community-based alternatives to these, the big corporate players. So a time bank, which is a kind of a barter service for errands, a food swap, which is an alternative food sharing, and a makerspace, which is shared tools. So I'm happy to talk about that as well. All right, so I thought I'd begin with the four major approaches that we see in the literature to understanding platform labor. And the first comes from conventional economics and sort of business schools, I would say, management studies and org studies to a certain extent. And these approaches focus on the efficiencies afforded by the technology and the sort of opportunities for entrepreneurialism. So the technologies involved, I've already talked about that crowdsourced ratings and reputational information. These platforms also use algorithms, as I'm sure you know, matching algorithms, if we're thinking about matching cars to, drivers to passengers, matching algorithms for search, if you want to rent a short-term accommodation on Airbnb or a VRBO. So the matching algorithms and a variety of algorithms. And the argument from this perspective is that, number one, the algorithms reduce management costs. So these companies don't have to have HR department, human resource departments. They don't need middle management. They don't need much senior management. If you look at the platform companies themselves, their full-time employees, they have very small numbers of employees, particularly, they've grown over time, but they're very lean there, and they hire these people as independent contractors, and so they're really not involved in high levels of screening and monitoring and so forth. And in fact, a key feature of these platforms is that they're almost open access, meaning almost anyone can sign up to work on them. There are a few minimal qualifications, like you need a driver's license if you want to be a driver, you can't have a criminal record, or you have to have certain aspects. So open access, reduced management costs, of course, enhanced efficiency in logistics. So for ride hail and delivery, the best routes, algorithmically controlled routes. In ride hail, the efficiency leading to a decline in what has been called wild goose chases, where drivers are driving around looking for passengers. The software is going to tell them exactly where the passengers are. Lower search costs for consumers. And that these features foster entrepreneurialism and the ability to be your own boss, such that, probably the first major work by an economist on this sector, by Arun Sundararajan at NYU, his book was called The Sharing Economy, The End of Employment. So you have this prediction that nobody's going to be an employee anymore. Everyone can be their own boss, work for themselves, be an independent, and this technology is what makes it possible. It solves the information deficits to reduce the risk of peer-to-peer exchange, what I talked about earlier through that crowdsourced information, and efficient payment systems. And this is kind of not that interesting, but it is an important part of why one of the things the consumers have liked about these platforms. Now, there's a lot that's right about this approach, but there are also some really big blind spots here. The most important is that this model fails to understand the risks that workers are taking here. So it doesn't really theorize those risks. It's just a boon for workers. And it doesn't deal with power and the ways in which platforms can exercise power over workers. So those turn out to be quite important. And they're the focus of the next two approaches. So the second approach is what, and I should say these terminologies and these four categories come from a paper that I did with my colleague Steve Vallas, which is published in the annual review of Sociology in 2020 on platform labor. I don't remember exactly the title of it. The Algorithmic Manager takes the view that it's all about the technology. And what's really key here is that these algorithms are able to control all aspects of the labor process. So it's a kind of very totalistic view. which is very technological, and it says these algorithms are incredibly powerful. They can surveil the workers and they form the basis for discipline. That the algorithms are set up to create asymmetries of information between the worker and the platform. So for example, in ride hail, which is where the asymmetry tends to be really strong, the rider and the driver are matched, but the driver doesn't know where the rider is going. Only the platform knows that. So the platform is blinding certain pieces of information. And this the idea is that that asymmetric information yields systematic power over the workers. Another dimension of this approach is what's called gamification, the ways in which the platform are using video game techniques to keep the workers on the job and working longer and longer, and using bonuses and levels and so forth, straight from the technology of video games. So the other aspect of this is it's kind of the flip side of the savings of the not having management. It's that the workers have no recourse to people when things go wrong, and they go wrong all the time. And they're just dealing with algorithms and automated systems and so forth. So there's a lot of complaints from the workers about arbitrary decisions, about the use of algorithms to deactivate, or the equivalent of firing workers and so forth. So, of course, the technology does matter. This perspective adds something very important. It also shows us what's novel. One of the novel things about platforms, not all the novel things, but one aspect of it. But it also greatly overstates how much of this is technology. On the one hand, it's always technology plus policies. So if we think about, say, deactivation, yes, it's the ratings and the information that is gathered by the platform that drives a firing or a deactivation decision, but it's also humans who figure out, at least originally, set the policies for, what's the rating below which you'll be deactivated? What are the incidents that will lead to a deactivation, et cetera? Secondly, it fails to see the ways in which the workers fight back against the algorithms and actually try and outsmart the algorithms, and whether it's multiple phones to try and trick the algorithms into thinking they're in a different place, or with some of our interviews we found, say in delivery, where the app asks the worker, or earner, to tell them what kind of mode of transportation they have. Are you on a bike or a car? They'll put in the wrong mode in order to get outcomes that they want and so forth. So there's a whole genre now of work that's showing the ways in which resistance happens. The third perspective, and perhaps the most common, at least in sociology and probably across the literature more generally, is the idea that what platforms have done is accelerated an ongoing process of creating more and more precarious work. A key feature of platform work is its precarity. These are, with very few exceptions, platform earners are independent contractors, do not have employee status. That's where I started the talk. Employee status in almost every place will give them a minimum wage, benefits, often health insurance, et cetera. But almost none of these workers are independent contractors. And what's happened is a kind of shift of risk to the workers. So the workers have to bring their own capital. If you're a driver, you have to bring your own car. If you're an Airbnb host, you have to provide. And the risks to that capital you bear as a worker. So it creates a much more precarious situation for the workers without all those benefits and supports that were put into place in the second half of the 20th century. This, of course, is what's different about this perspective in comparison to the first two, is that the growth of precarious labor, or what Guy Standing called the precariat, has been something that in the global north has been going on since the 1980s. And of course, in the global south is a very, very widespread dominant feature of labor markets. I mean, very few workers in a place like India or Brazil have all of those protections, are formal workers. I mean, in India, I think something like 90% are informal sector. And informal sector, almost by definition, tends to be precarious. So here, the technology really is playing pretty much no role, and it's all about the shift from employee status to independent contractor, and a kind of intensification or acceleration of the neoliberal model. One person called it, neoliberalism on steroids. So a lot of the work is about the increased vulnerability, risks, et cetera, that workers are bearing under this model. So the fourth perspective is what we've called institutional chameleons, that you can't really think, this one, it's a small literature, but it's an important one, which says, look, if you think about it just from the perspective of one country, and think that that's what a platform is and does, and that's what the platform label model is, you're going to get a very skewed perspective, and one that doesn't fit other countries. Because in fact, if you look across countries, you see that platforms operate differently. And this research has been focused, the published stuff has been focused in Europe and the United States, and comparing them. And basically you had people saying, look, when Uber came into Sweden, it followed all the rules of Swedish taxi industry, and the workers got all those benefits, and they weren't treated, they didn't have to bear the risks and so forth. Or the Netherlands, which the government quickly, said what Uber was doing was illegal. Or Germany, where they wouldn't even let Uber operate for a long time because it wasn't following labor laws. So the idea is that it's really the regulatory context that drives the labor model, and there's really nothing unique about platforms. Again, this one has an important insight, which is, yes, they operate differently in different places. Last year, a court, or maybe it was this year, not long ago, a British court declared that Uber had to reclassify its drivers as employees, and it has done that in Britain, but it's fighting it tooth and nail in the United States. Increasingly, we're getting research from the Global South, which supports very much this idea that you have to really look at the context in which the platforms are operating. So for example, one of the big findings from a number of countries is that the subcontracting model, which is common in places with big informal labor markets, the subcontracting model has kind of moved wholesale onto the platform, so that unlike in the United States, where the driver, or Europe, and the worker, or the driver and the platform are mostly interacting directly with themselves, in some of these cases, you'll have a subcontractor there who's mediating that relationship, whether, say, for driving, they're getting the cars for the workers, or they're just pre-existing networks of subcontracted workers who are then moving on platform. And you see some really exploitative relationships here. And sometimes the platforms themselves are doing it. Work in Kenya on Uber about predatory lending that they're involved in, for example, getting cars for workers and so forth. I have a graduate student who's doing really interesting work in India, which also supports this idea, looking at the platformization of certain industries. So she looked at the beauty industry, she looked at plumbers and electricians. And one interesting thing is, so for example, in beauty, where you had a lot of informal work, the platform is formalizing the work. So it's giving the workers uniforms and giving them training and so forth. So in contrast to the global north perspective, where more formal labor markets are being informalized, you have other contexts where informal labor markets are being formalized. And you do also have that in the global north, particularly with what we call care work, which is babysitters and elder care, and people who are providing caring labor to households. which again is typically, there's a big informal labor market there, are going on to platforms. The biggest, the Uber of the care work sector is called care.com, one of the ones we're studying. Forgot to include that in the slide. Apologies. But that's doing more formalization because it's creating more formal relations and search algorithms and so forth. All right, so those are the four. And now I want to turn to my own perspective and one I developed in the book After the Gig, and Steve and I wrote about in this paper, and I'm continuing to work on, which argues that we really need to understand platforms as a hybrid. And there are insights from all of these four, but you need to combine them in a different way. So let me start by just reminding ourselves about the conventional model in which the employer controls hours and the labor process. So here you have a centralized factory, the employer is surveilling, they're restricting access to the jobs and so forth. So your typical, what you think of as a typical conventional firm. Now, with and using technology and labor policy. And by the way, technology, the Algorithmic Manager is, the idea that technology controls workers is not new. The assembly line, for example, is the most famous case of a technology controlling the speed of the line, the speed of production. So it's what Richard Edwards in his wonderful book Contested Terrain called technological control. But that idea that technology controls workers is an old one, not really understood by those algorithmic management people. In the platform model, what happens is that the employer cedes control over hours of work and schedules. It also mostly cedes control over who gets to access to the work. As I said, it's mostly an open access model, sort of a low bar for getting onto the platform. And it concedes control over a number of aspects of the labor process. So control over hours, scheduling, labor process, and barriers to entry. And this is where the analytic point comes in. Like when we start to think about that, how does that differ? How does that make platform firms differ from ordinary firms? One of the things we come up with is it creates a labor force with a lot more diversity than in the conventional model. In the conventional model, the employee steers because people apply to work at the place, and the employer steers them into particular jobs based on their race, their gender, their educational qualifications, all of that. So this is different. This is, this is a situation where pretty much anyone comes in, they choose their hours of work and so forth. And that means you get these really diverse labor forces. So I think that's what's really unique. There's a kind of hybridity to these platforms firms. I've called that first point that I just made the retreat from control. So the firms are not controlling certain things. They're letting the workers determine those things. It's something they talk about a lot. The critics have really downplayed it because they say, oh, people really can't control their hours of work. The wages are too low. They have to work to market demand, et cetera. That's all true to a certain extent. And I'll show you more in a minute about the ways in which I think it's not so true. Second, the open access, and I've made that point. So how do they then control the workers? We know, from a heterodox point of view, we know that firms have to control workers in order to get profit from them. The neoclassical model of the voluntary exchange of work in which it's once they make a contract, there are no issues. We know that's wrong. That's the Marxian problem of labor from labor power, or what came to be sort of reformulated in the contemporary era as the efficiency wage model, which they have to set wages above the market clearing in order to extract labor from labor power. And the conventional version doesn't quite use those terms, but it's basically the same model. So what I've argued is that They do use technology. There's no question about that. And if you think about those typical efficiency wage models, like the one that Sam Bowles published in the American Economic Review, 1985, that then, he and I worked on a model of strikes. When do workers go on strikes? The concept of the cost of job loss, or it's the value of the job to the worker, the rent, the employment rent. So they use that employment rent. They use that cost of job loss, which I'm calling market discipline. So the discipline of the market, like the cost of losing the job. Plus they use technology in the same way that in that efficiency wage model, the firm was trading off surveillance technology and wage incentives. So that's what's going on here. And what I found is that the extent to which workers are dependent on the platform, and this is where it differs from efficiency wages. Efficiency wages, are folks familiar with efficiency wages and that concept? Employment rents, cost of job loss? Yes, no, do I need to go into that more? Can I see some thumbs up, thumbs down? Just, it's important to the argument, so I want to make sure. Thumbs up. Okay, great. Well, I see one anyway. I'm not seeing too many of you. What we found in our research is a little bit different. So in the efficiency wage model, which tends to have has a bit of a neoclassical dimension to it. It's the worker. It's really the size of the rent that determines how hard the worker works, whether they go on strike, how much they press for wage increases, work intensity, etc. Here, and that's just the difference between what they get on the job versus their next best alternative. Here, it's and in a way, this is a more sociological idea, because it's really about something very basic, like, can they pay their basic expenses? So how do these earnings on the platform relate to their need to pay their rent, their food, their gas, etc.? And what we find is that the workers who are depending on the platform to pay their basic expenses are much more, they're more controllable by the firm, but they have much worse outcomes. The workers who are casual employees, or what we call supplemental earners, and that's back to this question of the heterogeneity of the workforce. A really big dimension of heterogeneity is how many hours they work. So you have, many people who are very casual earners on these platforms, and they have other jobs and other sources of income. So they're not relying on the platforms for their basic incomes. Those folks are much harder to control. They have much better outcomes, etc. The work is not precarious for them. In fact, it reduces their precarity because it gives them extra earnings to reduce their financial precarity. People who are platform dependent have high precarity. Another thing we found is what we've called homovariance or homogeneous diversity. We changed the terminology to be more correct. But basically, people have different orientations to earning on the platform, whether they're Homoeconomicus, rational earners, whether they're target earners, whether they have like strong social dimensions, etc. And I'll show you that. So one of the things I would say here, and the reason I think we developed this explanation or this model is we had a multi-platform study, and we weren't just looking at Uber. So many of the studies were just looking at Uber or food delivery, which is pretty Uberized. So I say that we're beyond Uber centricity. Okay, so what were our data and methods? In the first project, we did in-depth interviews plus surveys, and I have tables for about 111 earners on 7 platforms. So Airbnb, Taskrabbit, Relay Rides, Postmates and Favor, Uber, Lyft. We collected from 2013 to 2016. We had started originally with that age range of young people because they were the only ones on the platform when we started. I mean, we were one of the first researchers to look at this. And we recruited mostly through the platforms, orientations, like we sent researchers to like onboarding sessions and so forth to try and get onto the platforms. And so they met people that way. We did some online group snowballing, and they had to have some minimum amount of experience. The new sample, the NSF sample, has been all Facebook recruitment because it's all been during the pandemic. It's all virtual. I don't have tables yet on this. We're still working through these. We haven't actually coded and transcribed them all, but we have a big sample of 160. So, now, I'm getting, got over 270 interviews for workers on lots of platforms. So I already made this point. Key finding is platform dependence. The dependent workers are wholly or primarily dependent on the platform for their livelihood. They rely on earnings to pay for their monthly expenses. They're roughly equivalent to full-time workers. Partially dependent are people who have these platform earnings. They need it to pay some of their basic expenses, but they have other sources, businesses, part-time jobs, spouses, etc. Supplemental earners, platform earnings are not part of their regular income source. They're extra. Many have full-time employment. They may use it for leisure activity. They may use it to pay down debt. They may use it for discretionary consumption, etc. Okay, a little bit about the sample. It's predominantly male. That's partly just the platforms, but because ride hail and food delivery are so big in this sector and they do skew male, in general, most of the studies will find a male labor force. A lot depends on what platforms you include. Our sample was a little bit under 60% white, which is very high. And that's a combination of a couple of things. Number one, we had a lot of Airbnbs, not so many Uber and Lyft drivers. We're in a pretty white location. We are using Boston Metropolitan, and it's a whiter city. These interviews were done early. This is the first set of interviews, and the lower wage platforms have become less and less white over time as the wages have declined, and so they became white workers in the US are more privileged, so they became less interested in working on these platforms, I believe. And so you got a much more a workforce of color, Black, Latinx, and also immigrant workers. So more and more, particularly ride hail and food delivery, you see more and more immigrants. And we see that also in our in the most recent interviews, the 2020 and 2021 interviews. One thing about these platform workers, and I think it's still true, although probably a bit less, they tend to have very high educational attainment. In the early days, everybody had a college degree. A lot of people had graduate degrees, even people working on the lower wage platforms. So you could see here, we've got over a quarter of our sample with graduate degrees. Half of them, almost half of them have completed college, and only 7% are either just have a high school degree. So super, super educated. It's partly the youth, but it's also, the apps and the technology and the way the sector was sold to people led to high educational attainment. Okay, I already showed you this slide. This is just the breakdown of that first sample, the 111. And what we found was 42% supplemental earners, 2% partially dependent, and about a quarter dependent. And this is pretty typical of the sector around that time. What's happened over time is in ride hail and delivery and food delivery, the number of dependent workers has grown. But you have on other platforms far more supplemental or partial. Okay, I'll just go through one or two of these. I'm going to talk about the cases themselves, the platforms of what we found in terms of this supplemental dependency. divide. So Taskrabbit was one of the early errand sites. So it was a general service site. So an earner can sign up on Taskrabbit and they create a profile and they say the things that they're able to do. So here's a Taskrabbit hanging pictures for someone. So kind of handy person work. Putting IKEA furniture together was a really big common task. In fact, so big that IKEA bought this platform in 2017 and they own it and run it. Driving, food delivery, grocery services. Before you had so many specialized platforms, this one, saw more of that diversity in this one. You could hire someone to, and all kinds of crazy things. We have people who were hired to do FaceTime tours around tourist sites or help someone with a college application. Or one of our interviewees talked about how her client asked her to write texts to a boyfriend that they wanted to break up with. I mean, there's a lot of wacky things. Dress up in costumes for events and product testing on app testing on iPhones. And most of it's in person. There's a little bit of online. Find me a great pair of sunglasses online, or, pretty much anything. It was very open. So this platform offered really pretty good wages. The bottom was about $25 an hour, far above the minimum wage here. We have people who talked about earning about $150 an hour. Our supplemental earners talked about the non-pecuniary benefits that alleviated boredom for them. So we had people who worked in regular jobs and young people who didn't know what to do with themselves after work, and they didn't want to just sit around and surf the internet. And so they would, earn money. They like to be productive. So there's a kind of productivist orientation to many of these people. Social benefits are often a strong non-pecuniary benefits, meeting people. We had one guy who had a little bit of a precarious life talking about how TaskRabbit led him to meet people, privileged people who he could rely on if he got in trouble. We have people who started businesses with the clients that they met on TaskRabbit, and so forth. So the supplemental earners were able to earn these high wages because they could be selective about the jobs that they took. Because in the beginning, TaskRabbit had an auction model where a task would be posted and the rabbits, they used to call them, would bid for them. And then it went to a more conventional, like an hourly wage model, but these people could set their hourly wage. So, they could set high wages and just take tasks they like. We had one guy, he hated to wait on lines, but waiting on lines for iPhones, with new iPhones when they came out, was a task that would be posted often. So he would only do it for $150 an hour. But he had a great profile, lots of great ratings. He was a really good worker, and he would get people who would pay him back. If you're a supplemental earner, you could avoid unsafe or problematic jobs. They could figure out where the scams might be, the things they didn't want to do. They had a lot of flexibility and autonomy. As I mentioned, for these earners, the platform reduces precarity because they use the earnings as a safety net. Many people had done other kinds of work, which was sort of exploitative or low paid, like catering and so forth, and they preferred this. And some manage a portfolio of earnings. So TaskRabbit is one thing that they do among others. What about the dependents? So our dependent earners on TaskRabbit, and I just want to remind us that this is one of the high wage platforms, pays much, much better than ride hail and food delivery, which require vehicles that are expensive to run and maintain, where you have on ride hail, some estimates of people making $3, $4, $5 an hour after expenses. High wages, but inadequate demand. So particularly after they shifted from the auction model, the wages went up, but you couldn't get enough to make a full-time living. And that's pretty much the story of platform work for dependents. It's really hard to make a full-time living on these platforms. Some people do it, but with grueling long hours. So our dependent workers made poverty incomes. They made below 20,000 US dollars or less. They lost flexibility and autonomy because they feel they have to take the jobs. They have to take whatever jobs they can get because there's not enough demand. That yields wage jeopardy and other kinds of jeopardy because they take the unsafe jobs, they take the jobs that may not pay off, etc. They're worried about their ratings. So they often cancel jobs in the middle if it looks like it's going to be someone who gives them a low rating. So they end up working without making money, or they end up getting hurt on the job. And then finally, the platform experiences of dependent workers have been on a downward trajectory in the sense that wages have declined, work has been harder to get, general conditions and so forth have gotten worse. Let me give you one other example, which is the food delivery. This is Postmates in favor. At the time we did them, they were pretty much bicycle couriers. People felt reasonable extra money, the non-pecuniary benefits of cycling for a lot of the people who did this. It attracted people who love to cycle. They were able to avoid unsafe conditions. And one of the things we found from these people, they didn't follow the platform policies. They did what they want because they are supplemental earners and they don't need the jobs. So for example, one woman who refused to get out of her car when she delivered at night because it felt unsafe to her, she makes the clients come down. And it's a huge violation of the platform policies. The people who wouldn't use the packaging or the stickers, or, they just wouldn't do what the platform wanted them to do because they didn't have to. And they said, they had a pretty low bar for telling the platform to, where they can to get off. On the other hand, the dependent earners, this food delivery was often the job of last resort. It had the lowest earnings in the bottom of the ladder, even below the ride hail, because there's virtually no capital involved. Erratic demand, so the food delivery just came at lunch and dinner. They have to sit around during the rest of the time. And particularly for the cyclists have vulnerability to weather, traffic. They have to work in unsafe ways in order to make enough money. So there's a lot of physical jeopardy there. And there's that sort of wage autonomy trade-off on some of these platforms. You can get one of the two we studied in the first set of platforms, in the first project. You could get a minimum wage of $15 an hour, but it meant you had to take every job they gave to you. So if you wanted to keep that autonomy of choosing what work you would do, you lost the minimum wage. So there was that kind of wage autonomy trade-off. Same kind of thing with Uber and Lyft. So just one point here, the new research from the NSF project, Instacart, Amazon, Deliv, this dependent supplemental distinction is also confirmed in this data, mitigating versus accelerated precarity. We also found chronic overhiring by some of these platforms during the summer and big problems getting tasks and work, which is something that had already developed in ride hail, where you have something like about 30% of the time the drivers are sitting around waiting for work in some cases. We also found some racial animosity around work availability as more people of color moved into these jobs. Some of the legacy white workers had resentments. And you could see the way the squeeze was happening in real time on Instacart, which was a shopping platform that expanded dramatically once the pandemic started and people didn't want to go into groceries. Okay, so this is, Homo varians, these three earner orientations that I mentioned. So Homoeconomicus, these people who are like typical textbook neoclassical rational actors. What we called Homo instrumentalis, people who are just earning to basically a target income. So they just have an instrumental need for income. They're not maximizing. They're not calculating. They're not figuring out the right price. They're not figuring out when to work. They're not keeping spreadsheets. They're not calculating their expenses. All of the things that Homo economicus are doing. And then what we called Homo socialis. These are people who won't maximize in financial terms because they have strong social goals. So whether it's avoiding status insults or meeting people or just enjoying the work because of the social interaction or so forth. And what we found, and it varies a lot by platform, so that our Airbnbs tend to have a high social and sort of low levels of Homoeconomicus. So you see pretty much the same number of Homoeconomicuses across the three platforms, but different numbers of, 8 in all three, but different numbers of people in each of the cases. So I assume everyone knows what Airbnb is. Stocksy was the platform cooperative that we studied. It's a photographers cooperative. They create stock photos. So the photographers take photos, they upload them. If they get accepted, they upload them to an image bank, and businesses buy those images. And we found that, again, it was very interesting that in the platform cooperative case where the workers own, you had some of those same differences between the dependent and supplemental earners, between professionals and hobbyists, between commercially oriented and artistically oriented that you found on the other platforms. We also found, again, these are just the cases from the first study, a platform hierarchy where, and I mentioned this, the food delivery was the lowest paid, then the ride hail, Taskrabbit, and Airbnb. Airbnb, of course, you have the most capital. Food delivery, you have the least capital. So the hierarchy conforms to the hierarchy of the amount of capital needed, but it also conforms to other kinds of differences. For example, roughly sort of the racial composition and the educational composition. More highly educated, whiter, more privileged earners at the top of the hierarchy, and the reverse as you go down. And this is a way in which the platform sector is replicating the conventional labor market. And I think a big lesson, finding of my research has been that the tendency, which was very much there in the literature, to kind of think of this sector as something separate and apart from the larger labor market is wrong. And, from a heterodox economist or conventional economist would not have sort of thought about this sector as somehow independent or, walled off in some way, understanding that people can always move between it and the conventional labor market. And, but the research has done very little to kind of tease out and understand the ways in which the two are linked. And I think that's a really important thing that needs to be done. And there are lots of ways to think about that, and we can talk about research design if people are interested. Just before I end, I want to say a word or two about the platform cooperative study. And because I do think platform cooperatives are a fantastic way to reap many of the benefits of this technology and way of doing things without the negative aspects. So we found that these workers were they're photographers. They wouldn't call themselves workers. These artists were very happy with the platform co-op. They had far better economic outcomes than when they were selling to Getty, who's the kind of McDonald's or the Uber of their industry. They got a much higher fraction of the purchase price. The governance worked well. People were really satisfied. There are challenges. So there's the heterogeneity of the member orientations that I talked about a minute ago, like the hobbyists versus the professionals. And there are tensions that arise in the governance with that. But the other thing about it is, and this is really something that all platform cooperatives have to deal with to a certain extent, unlike offline cooperatives where people are making a common project and you can set a wage so that everybody who's doing the same thing can get the same wage, is a highly unequal revenue distribution. In fact, it's kind of astoundingly unequal. So there was a very small number of earners on this platform who got nearly all the money. and you had lots of people who earned very little. Now you see that on platforms in general, in part because of that differences in work effort, so number of hours worked, because they differ so much across the platform. But here you have it even more because you've got the issue of talent, and the platform attracted some really talented photographers and they sold a lot. So there's not, if we think about solidarity, you've got this highly, highly unequal distribution here. And then there are generic challenges for all platform cooperatives. How do they get finance? How do they attract customers? And also what we call the tyranny of the market. They have to perform to market demand. So sometimes the problem is that there isn't enough market. One of this platform is very successful in terms of market, but you had complaints from some of the photographers about the fact that the market just wanted a certain kind of photograph. We called it neo-imperialism. They wanted white, Western, affluent people in the photos. And so it really limited what would sell, and therefore what the commercially oriented people could do. So final slide, platform labor analytics, key findings, a new type of labor regime, high heterogeneity across numerous dimensions. Technology is key, but kind of political economy factors are also really important. Power matters a lot, and power between workers and platforms. It can be a very highly desirable economic form for workers. However, not unless they have good alternatives and have, not if they're dependent, because the success of the model, I have argued, is because the platforms are parasites on the conventional employers, because the happy workers are the ones who have conventional employers as well. And is it a viable model over the long run? Can the platforms profit without more labor control? One of the things we saw from the low-wage platforms is attempts to get more and more control over the workers. So the answer to that may be no. And finally, employment status is likely to transform the whole model and sort of revert it to a much more conventional firm. So let me stop sharing there, and we can open it up for questions.